how is like it changing the lives of people living on the street from what you've seen? I spoke with Donna, who works with you, and she said it's kind of harder to find people who are out on the street now that you've been working with.
It is.
What has changed exactly?
Well, the reason why it's harder to find people because, people go through certain things and we don't know what they're going through when the sweeps happen. That can be a trigger. That can be somebody who may be wanted by law enforcement. A whole lot of things can take place. So being associated with the event of the move makes it harder because now they have to figure out who's to help and who's here to hinder. So once they get that understanding that, no, we still Code Tenderloin, we still want to help, we still want to aid, and the only reason why we're out here is because we understand that if you get pushed from this area, you may reconvene in another area. So that conversation actually now is having us ask them, where you rotate to, because you may be interested in going home. Let me introduce this program to you. Or you may be interested in detox. Let me give you these resources. So we there, and it helps because they are scattered and now they're not in the same location. Because doing this work, we get accustomed to what we call hot spots, where most people congregate. So we usually go directly to those areas. But now with the sweeps and people being scattered, we attempt to give the information so that it'll scatter with them.
Gotcha. And I just want to tell readers that we're also open to questions. If there's anything that you hear here that you want more information about, I'll be able to relay some of those to our panelists here. I wanted to move on to Christin. You've been monitoring some of these city operations. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, so the city has always had the ability to do encampment resolutions, right? So the approach has been in the past where we've assembled what's called the Healthy Streets Operations Team. It's managed by the Department of Emergency Management. It's usually championed by the fire department in terms of the leadership. And then they have SFPD there. They have traffic control and a couple of people from social services. So they usually would post a 72-hour notice. You'll see it on posted on a wall nearby or a pole, light pole, or a tree. That's what's changed, is that they're no longer requiring notice, and they're also no longer requiring offers of shelter. So the Healthy Streets Operations Team is still doing the 72-hour notices. They're posting those and they're on a schedule. But the mayor issued a press release that basically said there would be what they called smaller encampment resolutions, which involved SFPD and DPW only. And those folks are not trained social workers. They don't have a trained social worker with them. So they're not making an offer of shelter that's really a bona fide offer of shelter. Her press release was carefully worded to say that these officers will have an ability to refer people to shelter. But just to be clear, those officers, in my experience, are not actually succeeding in placing people into shelter in a practical way.
So that kind of gets to a follow-up question, and sort of what I was hoping to hear is that we know that these operations are happening and that there's more of them happening and that people are moving around, as you said. And but we're actually seeing over the last week, I saw a slight decrease in the number of people in shelter. So I'm just trying to figure out, where are people going?
Mm-hmm. You're talking about the dashboard on the HSH website. So to be clear, I actually did a lot of query at our August 1st meeting about the status of shelter and where we're at in terms of capacity. So when you see that there are some empty beds available on the shelter dashboard, it's a roll-up of all types of shelter that we have. When we opened the first MSC South, the big mega shelter in the early 90s. That was the first one. We now have 53 shelter programs that include Elizabeth's tiny homes village, but it also includes hotel rooms like at the Marnock Hotel, and some of the other larger hotels that were used for SIP hotels have been converted to non-congregate shelter. What mostly has happened is that not all the shelter has capacity. The types of shelter that HSOC is referring people into, they have a bed allocation. I've heard in the last week or two, it's been like 3 beds a day. So basically they have 3 beds. They're going and they're maybe interacting with 20 people throughout the day. And some of those 20 people may accept one of those 3 beds. But in practice, like functionally, the shelters are not accessible to people on the street. There is a wait list that you can put on for the large congregate shelters, 3 of the large congregate shelters. You cannot put yourself on the wait list for a non-congregate shelter or a tiny home.
And Steve, has that been your experience when you guys are offering shelter? Is there actually beds available? What is your allocation like on a night-to-night basis?
Well, it depends on what we're looking for. So we have a program, Night Navigator program.
Can you make sure you're talking?
Oh, yes, sir. So we have the Night Navigator program, and then we have a relationship with the Dante Hotel. So we have some 20 some odd beds there. But every night it's not availability, but we do get the availability before the night shift starts. So with that aspect of it, we are aware. But we also communicate with JSOC and all the different shelter locations. So they do give us the availability every day. We communicate with SF Hot, so they have a list. They can look at the list and they can get the availability and they can transfer the information to us, Code Tenderloin. And then throughout the day, then we see how many people that we can get placed. We also utilize the detox as well. So we look at some of those aspects and utilize that bed space as well.
Yeah,
so
but just to be clear, we don't really have that much low barrier shelter. So we have one Dolores Street shelter. You can actually go at a particular time and do a walk-in. And I asked for specifically from the Department of Homelessness how frequently people are lining up for those beds and how many people are being turned away. And we don't have that information. It's not on a dashboard. Mm-hmm. So, and we know that there's several hundred people, that would be willing to take a congregate shelter bed, but there are also a lot of people that would prefer a tiny home or, they've had a bad experience with a congregate shelter. And so they would really like to be able to go to a place where they can go with a pet or as a couple or have access to a private bath. So there are different reasons why people might not accept what is being offered in that moment.
Elizabeth, I see you taking notes over there.
I'm learning some things.
Okay. So I want to ask, broadly, what you think about what has been said so far, and then off that, I'll ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, we have been doing encampment sweeps for a long time. So to some extent, I think it may be a little sensationalized, but it certainly has been increased. But it wasn't from none at all to now all of a sudden a new policy. But the intensity of it has changed. And I think the one thing that is most importantly that has changed is that the outreach workers and the police now have one more tool. When they were clearing encampments, they didn't have the teeth to it, which is to be able to actually cite someone. And so now that they have something that is more durable, let's say, in terms of a tool, that's both good and bad, but it's really the one thing that's changed with the encampment program. And, I think the biggest question is, where do people go? Do we have places for them to go? Because we're seeing other cities who are now passing the laws that say there's no sleeping in our city limits. And if you're not going to let people sleep on the streets, you've got 3 choices. You can either arrest them and put them in jail, which is, $300 a night. You could shoo them outside of town or they end up in the wilderness and we end up with environmental problems and wildfires. Or you can shoo them to the next town and then you have civil war, right? There's no place, they don't vaporize. And so unless we have a place for people to go, then we're just causing problems for ourselves only for the optics of looking like we're tough on the problem. And it costs so much money to do all those encampment sweeps. It'd be better use of that money to actually build places for people to go.
So a lot of this debate kind of revolves around this portion of people who decline shelter or don't want to go to a congregate shelter, which is generally the thing that's available. I want to ask, starting with you, Steve, what should the city do when somebody declines shelter? What is generally your protocol? If you're telling somebody, hey, I have a bed for you, what is the follow-up there with that person, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, basically to just continue the conversation with, because they can refuse today and accept tomorrow. Mm-hmm. If we don't do those follow-ups and we're not out there continuously, then we'll lose a lot of people with that rejection. Then we find out that a lot of the rejection is the condition of the shelter. It's a couple. I'm worried about my dog. I don't want to give up my property. So there's rules and regulations on how you get into the shelter. So we attempt to give that information as well, as clear as we can. Yet they still disagree or refuse the shelters based off of whatever the personal issue is. And that right there, you're only going to learn with the engagement. So we don't know really why they would reject until we are actually communicating, talking to that person, talking to that couple, and then we get an understanding about that. And then we attempt to steer them. Some people have children, that they have to get out off the streets. Some have children they want to get back in the school system, so they need to have a in and out policy. So it's a lot that go with it.
I was just going to build on that and say, the city does not currently require that we document the offer of shelter and the reasons for decline and what the person would accept. So that's something we're not currently tracking at all.
That would be very important, because it is about the variety and the choices. And, we have to keep the humanity first and foremost. These are human beings and they do have preferences and needs. For instance, there's the stereotype that people turn down shelter because they're not allowed to use drugs. It's actually usually the other way around, is they don't want to be around people who are active users and creating problems for them. Maybe they're trying to get sober and the temptation is a trigger. So we do need to think about a variety of choices. And some people who want to be intense, that should at least be a sanctioned place. That could certainly be an option. Somebody who is traumatized doesn't want to go to a group shelter and sleep on a cot in a bunk bed. Homebound Program is an option. But if you have a portfolio of choices for people, then something's going to meet their needs. I think it's a myth that people prefer cement pillows. They don't. They prefer it to what they're being offered.
So we've mentioned the Homebound Program a couple times. So I just want to make sure that viewers at home understand that's a program where the city connects people to places where they've been previously and gives them a bus ticket or some mode of transportation to go to those places. I want to kind of hone in on this declining of shelter a bit more, because I think what I'm hearing here is that, there are a lot of justifiable reasons why people maybe aren't comfortable going into a shelter where maybe there's a lot of drug use going on, or they can't bring their significant other, or, there's people with mental illness inside and they just don't feel safe. Women, particularly, that I've spoken to, really don't feel safe inside these congregate shelters. I think the disagreement potentially comes about when we ask, Stephen, like you said, maybe they're not open today, maybe they're open tomorrow. How much patience does the city have with these people? What should be the policy when, you walk up to somebody and, when there's 20 city workers surrounding these people, maybe they're a little overwhelmed. I just wonder, how can we do this in a way that's actually going to get people into shelter? Because we're not seeing that right now through what's currently happening. What is people also don't want to see tents on the sidewalk. So they want to see the city do something about that. Where is the middle ground? Where is the balance? I don't know if you want to chime in on that.
Yeah, no, I think, first of all, I think that if you've got varieties of choices, then the person is likely to accept something. But if they won't, then at least there needs to be a sanctioned place where people are collected and where there's oversight. If they have to pick up their tent and move it ought to be to a designated place where then the service providers can find them. So the problem about shooing them out around the city is then they've been working with somebody. They've been working with somebody like Stephen's team. And so, first of all, the trauma is that it causes to get them shooed down the street and arrested and treated like a pest. That we're trying to get these people to trust the city, to start leaning into the system and to be willing. And that's obviously counterproductive.
Yeah, so there have been other approaches in the past that have been more effective, right? There have been approaches where they identify a location and they work over a 30-day period, working intensively with an individual to assess them for, do they qualify for certain benefits, for certain housing, and then work to meet that person's needs, whether they're a veteran, whether they're have specific child needs or whatever it is. They want to be able to move into a unit with a young child. So there are different, ways that we can actually work with people to get them inside. Unfortunately, the current allocation of resources and this mayor, she's been in this job for 6 years. has really made choices to oppose Prop C, oppose money and new resources. She's unfortunately really taken this performative tact to basically, issue press releases and making old programs sound brand new, making a little bit more tougher love, a little less compassionate. It's a very performative to, basically a public in an election year. And unfortunately, people aren't as informed about the real hard work, which is that our cost of living has gone up substantially in the city. You compare San Francisco to other cities that have equivalent levels of substance use disorder, right? Like drug epidemic is not a uniquely San Francisco thing, but there are other cities that have very high levels of substance use, but they don't have the same levels of homelessness. The big challenge for us is that the cost of housing is just so high, and where a Social Security or fixed income check of $1,600 might get you a studio apartment in another city, it's not going to do it here.
I do want to chime in on the shelter resistance thing, though, because first of all, the biggest reason people aren't in shelters is we don't have enough shelter beds. And what we do have, there are utilization issues, which is, another issue. But first of all, we got to have supply, right? And if you're forcing someone into shelter and you don't have a shelter bed, but they got 3 allocated for the whole, outreach team, that's going to be a problem. And so, but the other piece of it is we think that they're denying shelter. They're denying what they're being offered. And we don't invest in shelter because shelter doesn't work. People don't get into the right mindset to be able to think about moving forward if they're only in a place for a limited time and they're worried about being abused or their stuff getting stolen. And so we therefore invest as little as possible in shelter. So we don't have enough of it, and it is not a pleasant experience. If we invested in shelter that would be appealing, for instance, I'll brag, but Dignity Moves, building little tiny communities, cabin communities where you have your own tiny home, people don't turn it down. They just don't. We have waiting lists and people coming and begging. We're just not making a product and service, a product that people want to buy.
I want to get back to the tiny home thing, but Stephen, I wanted to ask, does that align with your experience? Do you feel like there just isn't enough beds or the right beds? You kind of spoke about it already, but just...
I do agree, and I do align with that because it's not enough. And what I mostly agreed with, and the reason why we perform the way we do is because we don't invest in shelter. So if the groups such as Code Tenderloin, and we offering things other than just the detox, because everybody's not on drugs that's homeless. That's another big misconception that we've been learning. You have a lot of San Franciscans a paycheck away from homelessness. So we have to keep that in mind. It's very expensive. A lot of people are not working with a living wage. So we have to address that issue as well. So the not having enough beds and then putting ourselves in a position to where we can communicate and follow up with the people that are placed. Let's go to a JRP program. What kind of technical skills do you have? So we want to have that presence so that they can start changing how they are looking at the shelter, and maybe that would decrease the amount of people that refusing the shelter just based off of, because word of mouth travels. Mm-hmm. That shelter is like this shelter is like that. I've read single women definitely don't like the congregate shelter. Then if you're going into detox, the first thing about detoxing with a couple, especially we've run into a lot that's actually legally married that want to go through detox, but the first step is separation. So now you separate the family. So it's a lot of issues with why they refuse and it not being enough beds.
Mm-hmm. I take a little bit of a longer view on this. We did start building up a pretty robust shelter system in the early 90s. And so this is, I'm a San Francisco, I've been here since I was 1 year old. So I've been here a long time and I've seen it get worse and worse over time, right? And so I do think that we have added a lot of shelter in that 3 decades, right? We're up to over 3,500 shelter beds, right? We have shelters that have been around for decades, right? What we haven't done is made investments in affordable housing. One of the real challenges that we have right now is that we actually have close to 800 permanent supportive housing units the city pays for that are vacant tonight. Mm. And so while some of those are offline because of needed repairs, and some of those are offline because they are waiting for a referral, because it takes about 6 months from the time that the person's deemed housing referral status to the time that they actually get into the unit. We actually have 160 of those 800 are totally uncommitted right now. And so we've been talking a lot at the commission about the Streets to Home program and trying to figure out how we can scale that up, so that we can even bypass shelter where it's not appropriate for certain people, right? That they can essentially be qualified as housing referral status and go from the street into their housing unit directly.
I want to take a moment to take a question from our Q&A here. RJ Sloan asked, is Homeward Bound still required to identify a contact in the destination city willing to provide shelter support? So previously, the Homeward Bound program, people had to have a home in the other city. My understanding is that this new Journey Home program, that isn't required. They have to provide some sort of proof that they have a prior connection to that city. I don't know what that means.
As I said, this mayor has not talked to people, so we don't know. Like, she's put a press release out. I've read the press release, but I think the providers themselves are actually trying to figure out that very question right now.
And you're pretty accurate with that. Based off of the Journey Home was made a little bit more low barrier. So you do have to have some type of connection, and they will help you, little food, clothing, put you up until it's time to leave, the time to exit. Where Homeward Bound was a little bit more strict, where you had to definitely identify a receiver on the other end. So in this point, that's not.
So are you seeing a lot of people accept those offers? Because the mayor issued a new directive a week or two ago that's basically city workers, anybody dealing with homelessness within the city is supposed to offer one of these bus ticket programs before anything else. Are you seeing people accepting that or wanting that?
People do accept, people do want, and I know through our office, we do refer a lot of people to Journey Home. I believe they can actually track that. So they should have a understanding on.
There is a dashboard. Yeah. So it's about 30 people a month right now. And so I would expect with the mayor's kind of focus on this, that the providers will retrain everybody on, what you're referring to, which is this broader bucket of relocation assistance, problem solving assistance, which might help people overcome barriers. Like maybe there's a relative that's willing to receive somebody, but they need to have some assistance with furniture and a mattress, for them. So the city is able to provide those type of resources. We call it in this bucket called problem solving. So relocation, basically the program of giving per person a ticket out of town has been there for decades, right?
About 15,000 people since 2005.
Right.
So
Yeah.
they've been around, but yeah, as you said, it's more low barrier now, and the mayor is telling everyone to do that.
Offer it first.
And so I don't know.
It doesn't matter if you are fifth generation San Franciscan, you've lived your entire life, you're going to get an offer for a bus ticket out of town, per her press release and her executive order.
And got a couple more points on that, but I really want to go back to Elizabeth, you were talking about the tiny home shelter, and Christin, maybe you can attest to this, Steve. When I've talked to people, they tend to like going there, and it does seem to be more popular than the congregate shelters for sure. And I think there's 70 people there.
There's 70 cabins, so depending on how many are couples, because you're allowed to be.
70 cabins.
80.
I just wonder, like in a city such as San Francisco, we've seen that approach like touted in other cities across the country, but in a city like San Francisco where land is so scarce, how do we upscale something like that? How do we make that happen in a way that's expedient and pragmatic and humane?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, the tiny home communities that we built, we use temporarily vacant land. So we can use emergency building codes, like what FEMA uses, and it's exempt from zoning, exempt from environmental review, all of those things because it is an emergency. Don't do foundations underground. We can run electrical wires above ground. So therefore, it's very fast and very cost effective to do. And it's like leave no trace. It's like Burning Man, right? At the end, you can pick up and leave. And so therefore, the cost of land is, we need to be more open-minded about that, because There are lots of projects out there. Commercial real estate developers have projects that they've got on hold because of the concerns about the economy. That land, some parking lot from a Walgreens, any of those are things where we could use it for 3 to 5 years, let's say, and at least get people off of the streets immediately and fast. And by the way, if it's privately owned, they are eligible for a exemption on their property taxes. So somebody who's holding land actually even gets a benefit. But the city doesn't own any land. I honestly agree that they have looked under anything that they could use. What about school district? What about the faith-based organizations? We're just not getting creative.
Christin, do you have anything to add on to that? Or
Well, so we do get a presentation every month from the director of the department, and her analysis is that the cost of providing shelters like the tiny home villages, like the non-congregate hotel rooms, is about $60,000 per year per person. And housing is closer to about $40,000 per year.
and that's because why is that?
Well, it's a combination of things. One is like when you're setting up a tiny village, they're basically short term. So there's a lot of cost in setting up the site. And then there's 24/7 staffing, that is very intensive staffing levels in the shelters. But also in housing, people contribute 30% of their income towards the rent. So it's actually less expensive
Absolutely.
to actually get people to housing quicker.
And you know what? That is really the crux of why we've got this problem, which is that permanent housing is largely funded by HUD, by Section 8 vouchers and other subsidies. When you've got somebody into interim housing, it's coming out of the city's budget, which is not okay. This just doesn't go far enough. But the thing is, this is where working with the private sector helps, because the city's paying $1.7 million per year to lease those parking lots on 33 Goth Street. In all the other cases, we lease it as a nonprofit for $1, right? So we can get that cost way down, and philanthropy is willing to come in when you're talking about $30,000 units, right? And so the urgent, quick solve of right now is the part that philanthropy and the private sector can really help with.
And I feel like they have tried, right? Like Alex Turk, famously was trying to have, I think, 1,000 conversations with people all over the city to try to identify sites. Nothing's really come of that, right?
That's the tide is going to change.
I do think we need systemic solutions. Like, I don't think we can rely. Philanthropy is good for trying out new ideas, just starting something up, like a starting cost. But these programs require sustained revenue streams. And so it used to be that most of our money for housing was from the federal source. It's no longer the case. It's all local. In fact, the Prop C, 50% of the funds or more have to go towards housing. The city also has had this pilot scattered site voucher program, which is like a Section 8 program. And it can be both a short-term subsidy, like a 2 or 5 year subsidy, or it could be a long-term subsidy, lifetime subsidy. So we're seeing a really big ramp up in the success of using those vouchers. With the help of doing those type of program, we've housed over 5,000 people with the Prop C money since it started to really hit the ground the last 2-3 years. Prop C passed in 2018, but it was held up in the courts. The money started to really roll out in earnest in 2022. And so in that time, we've actually been able to make a big dent in terms of housing a lot of people that are chronically homeless. But it needs to be sustained stream.
I think you all hit on an important point and I think it's one of the pitfalls in discussing homelessness, is that there are so many systemic factors that go into this. And, I think a point that you were touching on is that, just building shelter doesn't stop people from becoming homeless. And if we're thinking about this just as homelessness and this silo from all the other issues that, economic and education and everything else that people are facing, that, we're probably not thinking about it the right way.
But let me jump in on that one really quickly, because shelter doesn't solve homelessness. Only permanent housing does. When somebody's in shelter, they're still homeless. They're just considered unsheltered homeless. So we can't prevent the homelessness. Well, we can in many cases, and the problem solving is by far the best bang for your buck in terms of solutions for the homelessness system. But when someone does become homeless and unsheltered, what we think about shelter doing is preventing the condition known as chronic homelessness, which means that somebody is on the streets for cumulatively over a year, 2 or 3 episodes, and suffering from a debilitating condition. That is preventable. And when people first become homeless, the vast majority of them are not yet traumatized to the point that they would never be able to be self-sufficient. It's surviving on the streets and the trauma of that exacerbates their condition so dramatically. And so if we can get somebody a safe shelter place rapidly when they first become homeless, they're still homeless, but they are not debilitating and becoming traumatized to the point that they become chronic.
Yeah. Stephen, how are you and your team approaching people on the street, and like what have you seen that works as far as communicating with people and getting them into a situation where they can move on?
Approaching them with respect, seeing some of the things that you see and doing your engagement, ignoring them, because if you give when you bring that respect level and you allow the community to see that you are actually there to help, then they'll be more forthcoming. So we have to bring that respect level, and we have to bring some viable resources for them, because like Christin mentioned, it's a gap between me offering it to you and you receiving it. So that's some of the area we can shut down on. And then looking at the tiny home situation, we have a lot of empty buildings. We can apply the same math to the tiny home that we can to an empty building, where it's already standing. Let's clean it up, defunct it, and put the people in there. That's a big opportunity that we haven't really addressed yet.
Yeah. I think it sounds like everybody's pretty much in agreement that the city is lacking on options for people, and that's a big part of the issue. Obviously, we hear a lot of rhetoric blaming people on the street for declining shelter. So I'm glad we got into that. I'm not sure if everybody here has seen, we've all seen the coverage of the encampment clearing operations in the past couple of weeks. In particular, there's a video one of our staff members captured that made the rounds. And I wonder what your reactions were to that. We could start with you, Stephen, when you saw those clearing operations taking place.
That it's a good opportunity because they're coming right back. So it's a good opportunity to be there, to have something to offer, because I saw that report that you were referring to, and they mentioned how it was cluttered, sweep came, now it's clear. A week later, tents start to reappear. That's kind of common throughout the whole San Francisco, and that's why we also use that tactic of being in those areas, because we know that the people are going to come back. But when they come back, this is our opportunity to assimilate that information, to let them know we're working on it this way, we're working on it that way. We have these other things that we can offer you as well. And then, looking at the tiny homes, I believe that they have nurses there, shelter help, and some of the places like the Dante, they have nurses there. So that helps a lot with the mental aspects of it, with the things that have not been addressed due to you being homeless. So those are things right there that's helping, and they continue to help, and that we have to let them know. Go indoors. We have nurses. We can handle you with that wound care. There's other things that you can do instead of just suffering.
So when you saw those videos and that coverage, you saw it as an opportunity. Do you feel like people are more open to working with you after something like that, or what? I'm trying to understand.
Well, that started long. The rapport with us in the community starts way before any of these encampment sweeps, or we go out to do resolutions. That you have to start that way early, because the community is also tired, because if we're addressing a problem, talking about unhoused people, they need to be in the room, because a lot of the things that they have to offer is information, and what will be accepted, what will not be accepted. Everybody making these decisions going home to a roof. There ain't nobody in the room that can give us that midnight aspect, that 3 o'clock in the morning aspect of what's taking place. And by us having a night navigator team, that's the reason why we use that as an opportunity to get there, because we see where they're being scattered from, and we see where they're regrouping. So that gives us that's a big advantage because we are out there in the middle of the night with the people.
Yeah, I definitely want to get more into, how things change at night and what that experience has been like. That's a pretty new program that the city wasn't doing before. And I see you guys out there a lot, and it seems like.
Yeah, you couldn't get into shelter after, 3 in the afternoon, right? Like, or 5 in the afternoon, right? Like, we don't have 24/7 access, right? So, and we don't have access on the weekends generally either, right? So like people really just don't have a lot of options if, they get kicked out of their shelter. Sometimes people get kicked out of their shelter. We have about 7 to 15% of people that are denied service from the shelter. They're looking to go right back into another shelter. If they get kicked out on a Friday afternoon, they're out of luck until Monday. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just making sure.
Yeah,
It's important also, we keep throwing around the lingo of congregate and non-congregate. So I want to make sure people understood the difference. Like your stereotype of a shelter is what they call congregate, which is one big room with bunk beds or cots, maybe little dividers, that kind of thing. And then there's non-congregate, which was hotels, like the ship hotels, where you have your own room. And that's what the tiny cabins are. And they're really very different products in terms of the service for the person. And when you're saying that there are extra beds available in the congregate, people have very good reasons not to want to sleep next to somebody who's a stranger next story. And all the stereotypes, maybe some of them are true, some of them aren't. But it's a completely different thing when you're offering somebody their own space where they can take a deep breath, right? And actually close the door and be alone.
And as far as my initial question about what your reaction was to that coverage and those videos, what did you think of those?
Well, I was horrified. I mean, I also know from experience that it's been happening all along, right? And it's great to have it captured on video so that the public is more informed about what's happening. Police are not trained social workers, and the DPW workers have a job, and that's to keep the streets clean. So their incentives are different than a social worker's incentive, right? To actually help somebody get indoors. And I just look at the waste of money, the fact that like we're putting so much money into police, to the fire department, to the they even have like 2 people that are parking traffic directors that are sitting there in their little vehicles and directing traffic around the vehicles, So we're spending so much money when we could, make our shelters more accessible through walk-ins. People would resolve their homelessness if they could put themselves on a wait list for what they would accept. We don't need these sweeps. This is a choice. This is a choice that the city has made.
Yes. That's exactly where I was going to go, which is that we're sounding like this is so hopeless and all this negativity of like, oh, it's a disaster. I want to be very clear. It's very solvable. Like it's a policy choice that we're spending most of our money on building permanent housing and not investing sufficiently in shelter. Although recently we have been building more of shelters of any type in the SIP hotels, and the percent of people homeless who are sheltered has gone up dramatically in the last couple of years. So that's a good thing that we are. But if we decided that we were going to allocate resources to building dedicated places where people can go in the meantime, we would get people to come indoors. And so if we're going to end encampments, we need to end the need for encampments. And unfortunately, our policy has been that we're trying to reduce homelessness, which means laser focused on building permanent housing, which, by the way, we absolutely need. But it's an yes and the streets are the waiting room.
Gotcha. So I'm glad you added that last point, because I was going to ask, what do you think the balance should be of housing and shelter? And I mean, could you explain why build shelter if, as Christin said, it's more expensive? What's the reasoning there?
Well, so first of all, in terms of more expensive, you have the units themselves, whatever that is. Buying a hotel, yes, very expensive. If you're doing a dedicated safe sleeping site, so it's the supportive services that are expensive. And but in terms of a ratio, if it was me, I would first get everybody someplace to go. Take the pressure off the system. 2 or 3 choices, whatever. Get people indoors.
What does that look like?
So what does that look like? First of all, it is a place. And so some of it is homeward bound. Some of them might be a safe sleeping site where they could bring their tents. Hopefully some of them are going straight into the housing, right? The streets to house. Some of them could be tiny cabins, but places. So if we could get people indoors, and you're not going to get 100%, but if you could get 60 or 80% indoors where the pressure's off the system, now those resources that we've saved, because it costs us twice as much to let people be on the streets, cleaning up feces and needles and encampment resolutions and the parking meter people. I mean, people understand it's costing us
hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. Yeah.
Well, and maybe $60,000 to $80,000 per person per year.
Yeah.
And so then that $60,000 a year of supportive services in interim pays back really quickly. Now, the services that are happening in that $60,000, obviously different programs it varies widely. Not all of them need to have intensive case management and intensive. If we had enough of them where we could diversify and specialize, you could have one site that is particularly for veterans, one that's particularly for women, and some of them need those services and some don't. But that services money that we were planning to spend on them when they finally got to permanent supportive housing years later, we could just shift that to the beginning of their homeless cycle when it has a higher chance of efficacy. And then those dollars are better spent.
We've all seen the crazy political fights of neighbors, and everybody gets involved when there's a new shelter coming to a neighborhood. How would we, I mean, because I want to talk
I do want to talk about my neighborhood, which has actually been fighting for more shelter. And this mayor has actually denied our neighborhood shelter in our neighborhood. Like, I just want to be clear that not all neighborhoods have been NIMBY. Mm-hmm. There are a lot is made of the NIMBY fights that happen. But in our neighborhood in the Haight-Ashbury, there's been broad community support for standing up more shelter, more transitional housing. And the mayor's really thwarted. I can point to multiple stories that covered this, attempted to essentially stand those up in our community, in our neighborhood.
We find positive support as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do, and there's some ways that you can make sure of that. Like in San Jose, what we're doing is you do local preference. So the people who are sleeping in the immediate area are the ones who get prioritized for the placement. So then that neighborhood is the one that is benefiting.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So I'm a merchant, a small business owner, and same thing that happened during the pandemic. We had this unprecedented amount of resource that came and was available. And initially there were some merchants that were really hesitant about having a safe tent site, camping site placed at 730 Stanyon. But a year in, people saw the benefit. They saw that the people that are in our community had a place to go, right? And that was a big shift. And so it actually got people off the street in front of businesses into a place, right?
Yeah.
So it was a benefit.
It's been really remarkable.
Exactly.
And we've got a project right in downtown Santa Barbara. It's sort of Morgan Stanley, for heaven's sakes. And the merchants around there think it's the best things ever happened to them. When you get the next neighborhood calling, going, I want one.
So my thing is like, let's say that Haight had a shelter that was accommodating 50 or 100 people. We just have to also focus on getting people through shelter to housing, right? And so if it's a younger person that is capable, maybe it's the combination of a job training, a transitional housing voucher. There's different ways that we can approach this to ensure that people are getting to stable housing more quickly. Right now, our status quo is that we have people in shelter for years, and that is just unacceptable. We need to actually get people moved out of shelter into housing.
There's a question here from Joanne who says, there's a lot of talk about the rights and desires of people on the street. Many citizens are concerned about the rights of people living illegally near these, the rights of people living legally near these homeless encampments. What would you say to them?
I think it's the argument that we would all be better off. I don't think any of us think that it's a good idea to have people sleeping outdoors. We all want to see people sleeping in a safer place. And so it really is about voting for, elected officials that will take these issues seriously and really put policies in place to put in what are long-term solutions needed for what is a problem that is decades in the creating. I mean, I told you that the first mega shelter that we stood up was in the early 90s. That's 3 decades ago. We're now over 53 separate shelter sites and programs in the city of San Francisco. That's ridiculous. I mean, that happened in my lifetime, right? I think it's going to take us years to reverse that. Prop C was a big part of starting that process, but we still have to be really serious and hold, Gavin Newsom accountable. Like the theatrics are ridiculous. Him rolling up his sleeves and throwing trash away is not an actual solution to homelessness. What is actually a solution to homelessness is funding affordable housing. This governor, the money that's coming from the state to the city right now is not committed. It means that every year we're waiting to see if we're going to get that 50 million or so that we're getting from the state renewed. And so the city is not able to make the investments with those dollars with no predictability that 50 million is going to be there the next year and the next year and the next year. So they're not making the investments. They're putting the money towards short-term solutions, what I call half measures, instead of actually going to the root causes and solving the problem once and for all.
We've got about 10 minutes left. And so I've got a lot of things I want to ask, but make a judgment call. I think we should go back to, it's hard to choose. Why don't I go back to you, Stephen, and you could tell us a little bit about how, so we know that the encampment sweeps or resolutions or clearings or whatever you want to call them, they aren't new. Things have changed in the past couple of weeks. But also something that changed about a year ago was the city launched this very deliberate crackdown on drugs in the Tenderloin neighborhood. And I'm wondering if you've seen a change from that, and if you could kind of like take us into what is going on the streets, especially at night these days, and how have things changed from that effort?
Dealing with the drug issue, I really can speak to that as far as the decrease, increase, or whatever on that level. But being out there at night and seeing the people a lot of people attempt to move away from heavy drug areas, even the unhoused. So we don't really engage in a lot of those areas. But if we do, then we are doing the exact same thing by providing something. We've seen drug dealers. We talk to drug dealers. They telling us we don't even want to be out here ourselves. Okay, we'll come with our JLP program. So our communication and our engagement is really just to bring a resource. I'm not going to pass judgment on who's ever out there in the middle of the night. I'm not going to be looking at you this way or that way. But I do have a JLP program that you might can get in. You can transfer those skills over into working for a Fortune 500 company. We can talk to them because some of them are mathematicians. Mm-hmm. They do a lot. So that drug degree, we really don't talk about it or address it, other than the fact that we know a lot of the people are moving away from them areas. Mm-hmm. They even communicate that because they're not really into the drug scene. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm saying. We find that it's a lot of people unhoused that's not on drugs. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of people unhoused that's unhoused because they may have a family member on drugs, mm-hmm. and they're out there with their family member. Mm-hmm. It's the dynamic. It's a lot of unique situations when you're out there in the middle of the night and you're seeing what you're actually seeing. And like Christian said, that from the street to permanent housing, the communication breakdown, because a lot of people that we're dealing with don't even have phones. Right. Don't have emails. It's a source of a lot of.
There's not like a self-service portal online where you can track your housing status and communicate with your social worker. We don't have that kind of level of service that people would take for granted if they're signing themselves up for their own apartment. Like I can go online tonight, right, and type in an application and see where I'm in the process of getting an apartment. We don't have that for the homeless service system, right? We don't have a self-service portal. We don't have a way for people to hold the system accountable to their process to get into housing.
And actually the closest thing we have to that is the shelter reservation dashboard.
Correct.
And I looked at it before this meeting, and there was 199 people on the wait list, and roughly 80 had an offer of a shelter already. We know that there's a 12-day wait time in June too. I'm wondering if you could give us a little insight as to why. I don't think many of these 80 are going to actually end up into
shelter.
What's going on there?
Yeah. So again, we're creating more bureaucracy, more delays, more barriers to getting people in. When people are ready to go in, we need to have that resource available for them to go in then, right? Like we need more walk-in options. What you're talking about is people can go online or call 311 and have assistance to be added to a wait list. It's a dashboard online. You're identified by, I think, your birth date or something like that. And 12 days is the typical time that it takes for the system to get to you to offer you a resource. But in reality, like in those 12 days, so much has happened in your life, right? Like you might have lost your phone, your contact, you got swept twice, you got relocated from the corner that you told them they could, where they could find you at. We actually heard that 60+% of folks, when they were going out to make these offers off the shelter wait list, you couldn't find the person.
So you said something about centralized, which I want to pick up on. Yeah, there's a lot of cities have been successful at that. I mean, if I had my magic wand and was going to try to solve this today, you first have to have one place where everybody knows to go, right? And people can give you a ride there. The police can give you a ride there. There's one massive walk-in center, right? And what they call them in San Jose is basic needs sites where you bring your own tent, right? They're not providing anything. It is not ideal, but it's better than being scattered out there. And then the service providers know where to find you. You're at least being supervised. You're in one place. And it is with the express goal of getting you out of there, right? To be very clear. But at least you start somewhere. And then we can start to, specializing, and you're a battered woman, you need to go domestic violence. You get them sorted, right? But have one place that they go first, and we all know where they go. Then they don't need to figure out how to get on a computer to get to a dashboard. Do you have anybody you've seen that's got a computer who's out there on the streets? Are we kidding?
And we had that under this mayor for a moment, right? Like we had the Tenderloin Center, right? That was that one spot. And people were really grateful because they could line up. They would wait an hour, they'd get in, they knew that they could see a hot team worker, they knew that they could check their status on the housing, and workers would be able to tell people, go there tomorrow at 10 a.m., I'll meet you, and then we'll get you moved, right? And so that was a huge improvement in terms of communication, just basic communication with people that are out on the street experiencing homelessness. But yeah, a lot happens in 12 days. People might experience sleeplessness, be sleeping that day, whatever, they're going to miss that opportunity. So a lot of times they're not getting that offer off the wait list, unfortunately.
And David, I just want to make one thing clear as well, because we was talking about the drug problem and the issue and how that's changed during these sweeps. We're not naive, or we not saying that people are not using drugs or it's not an issue. It's just not our focus. We want to focus on the unhoused and getting the resources to the people, because, SLPD, they got a lot on their plate already. So however they conducting their business in those areas, they conducting their business. But we conduct our business in those areas just by simply bringing a resource. And if the drug dealer want to put down his drugs and go through a JRP program, we're going to offer it. We're going to give him that opportunity. In the unhoused people that's there, like we was talking about streets to shelter, we need to eliminate that. We need to get them some communication, because that is a big issue, the lack of communication. Even with the people that's not on drugs, they're not getting to the library on time. Once 2 or 3 nights pass by, now I need a shower. So the library and getting on that's not my focus anymore. I need to get into the shower. I need to try to find some work. I need some temporary relief. So it's a whole lot of things that take place in the middle of the night and during these hours of drug dealing and all of that, that's more prominent and more important for us to be paying attention to than simply just the drug dealers.
Are there times, and how often, if there are times, when somebody wants to go to a program and there isn't a bed available or there isn't a spot? Does that happen?
All the time.
All the time.
You can get in the middle of the day, I can communicate with someone. We have 3 beds, two congregate shelter beds and an 88 bed, but you have 200 community workers trying to fill those 3 beds. So you could be talking to somebody and that bed will vaporize. maybe it's another worker has already filled that bed.
And the same for treatment, right?
Yeah,
Deep detox too. Can you always get someone into detox 24/7 or no?
No, you cannot.
Yeah,
Always.
yeah. So that's my experience too. When people have like said to me, I'm ready to go into a residential treatment program, it can take weeks to get somebody like through the hoops to get them to that treatment bed.
Sure.
Hey, we're beds. Are you hearing that?
Yeah, I'm hearing that.
And that's where we have to get creative.
I had a feeling that was going to be the topic of the day. We have a plan. Well, the city has a plan to cut street homelessness in half by 2028 and total homelessness by 15%. They say that they need an additional $600 million over the next 5 years, as well as an additional $217 million annually after that in order to accomplish that goal. I think some of that would be going into prevention. Start with you, Christin. Do you think we're on track at all to meet that goal?
So the strategic plan that you outlined, I think it's not ambitious enough. I think it's achievable, but it's not ambitious. With the new revenue stream of Prop C, those goals of reducing homelessness by 15% are probably slam dunk, like pretty achievable. I think that we need to talk about there's some fairness, and like the Prop C money was a lot of money very quickly to basically get out the door. And so a lot of this is now we're like analyzing and reviewing results and figuring out the new things that we tried. Did it work? Did we save money? Did we improve the way that we were doing service delivery to get people somewhere quicker, faster, better outcomes, right? So we're doing that constant analysis review of how has the money that we did get is being well used, but ultimately we will need to scale what is working, and that will require new revenue streams.
And there's optimism here. I will also say that we as a society are taking this much more seriously. So Proposition 1, which narrowly passed, is going to bringing a lot of money towards mental health care and beds. And the newly rebranded, restructured Medi-Cal here in California, called Cal-AIM, will actually pay for a lot of those services, albeit on a reimbursement basis. But a housing navigator or an intensive case manager gets reimbursed just like an MRI would. And so there's funding that's coming from federal and state sources for particularly the ongoing supportive services, which is super expensive. But it doesn't have to be as expensive as the city is that report is, because we need to be getting creative and things.
I think redirecting money to things that are not working to the things that are.
Absolutely. And I don't want to redirect anything. Obviously, we're about interim housing and not a proponent of taking money from permanent housing. That's actually what we need.
Yeah.
We have a waiting room, but we can certainly spend less cleaning up feces and needles.
So like one of my examples of, there was like a big push to do sober living, like sober housing, right? And so the city is basically identifying sites to put up sober housing sites, but they're doing it by not growing the pie. They're shifting resources away from other programs to accomplish that. That is like the silliest thing, because it's extremely popular with voters. They could have put on a bond measure or another type of revenue measure in support of sober living facilities, and voters would have passed it. And instead of doing that, they made these choices to really cut into existing programs. Instead of growing the pie, they're, pitting providers against each other, which is really not the way that we need to be addressing this problem.
All right. Stephen, do you see optimism in your work?
I do. It's a lot of optimism in what's taking place, what's been going on. And there's a lot of collaborations that's been taking place, which also is a great help to the problem. Having different organizations, community-based organizations come together, and each organization taking a role. What you're good at, what you're best at. If we start collectively attacking the issue, then, like you said, she said a mouthful. It's very achievable, at the same time, it's some of those finer things, those finer details that get overlooked or they get cut that's actually aiding and helping the issues. You know, there ain't no sense in having an empty building when we're talking about homelessness. It's an empty building on the corner.
It's too many vacancies.
You know,
Yeah, too many
That
vacancies.
doesn't make it. You have
Yeah.
a budget already. Those buildings can fit inside of that budget, and we can use the same arrangements of having mental health providers there, nurses there, and case managers there, social workers there. Getting what Attorney Holmes is doing, because that when you bring a person from the street, you don't know what effects have happened in between being on the street and now you're inside of these four walls. And a lot of times, a lot of the people that do get placed, they end up losing their housing because we forget that it's trauma that took place. You know, we forget that you had a conversation with somebody who's been in a drug stupor. It's going to take him 4 or 5 days to remember where I am. You know, and then he loses the bed for not occupying the bed. So little things like that we have to correct in the process of not only making it more streamlined, but making it, having a more of an understanding of putting ourselves in the shoes. So that empathy aspect of it has to come into play, because that plays a major role, especially when you're talking about people who are not fully aware or fully in charge of their faculties. It's a lot of things going on. So we have to take that in account when we're talking about addressing the issue.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of agreement here on what the solutions are. Obviously, these solutions cost money, so hopefully we are able to, or we do see the city kind of positioning funds in a way that's makes sense. Is there any closing thoughts that you guys have to rewind back to the sweeps or the resolutions or the clearings or whatever we're calling them? When I asked you guys about solutions to this, I don't really hear that really tossed around as an idea. I mean, does this set the city, what trajectory does this set the city in that we are moving people around frequently now?
Well, so first of all, I'm a big silver lining person and an optimist, so I can usually find a silver lining in anything. And I believe that we are poised with the opportunity to solve this problem. And the reason I say that is because now that the Supreme Court ruling has happened and cities are allowed to clear encampments, there are no more excuses, right? And so that's the first thing. And Newsom's executive order saying, I want people off of the state property now urgently, that is creating urgency. So those things, the conditions are right, saying we need to do something urgently. The downside is, what is the something? And that's where there isn't funding for it. And you're going to have some cities doing the wrong thing of just being urgent because it's a political year, because it's an election. But the thing that is important to note is that building enough beds, which I think you've heard everybody here say over and over again, happens to be the one intersection of different political views. If you're compassionate, then building enough beds is the compassionate answer. If you really care about your streets being clean, then building enough beds is the way to deliver that. And if you're fiscally concerned and you want your taxes to be as low as possible, that saves money. So even the most cynical politician, the right answer is still the right answer, which is to build enough places for people to go. And the chest thumping and waving a flag saying, look at me, I'm clearing encampments, it's not going to fool people very long. If you don't have a place to put them, it's a whack-a-mole.
And I agree with that, especially when you look at the economy. So the same answer is more beds for the local businesses, for to bring back the San Francisco nightlife. This is one of the biggest tourist, cities in the world. Where do people still want to come here? We need to check that down. So more beds is a big solution to everything that's taking place.
Closing thought?
Well, it's an election year, so I say be skeptical when politicians don't answer your questions and they deflect with, we need more conservatorship, we need more sweeps, we need to pressure, we need to tough love, because they've been in office for a long time. They know that the real solution is more offers that people will accept.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all so much. Hopefully our viewers got something to take home and think about and maybe take to the polls or to their local electeds. Yeah, I appreciate everyone for joining us, and I will try to get to some of these questions afterwards. So thank you all for chiming in, and
Thank you for
thank
having
you for
us.
joining us.
Thanks for having it.
Yeah.
Thank you.